Hey guys, tonight let's slow everything way down. Dim the lights, put the phone face down, unclench your jaw, and let your thoughts gently drift toward a place that technically existed, possibly existed, or maybe existed emotionally, depending on which ancient historian you trust. Tonight, we're beginning with Babylon. Yes, that Babylon, the big one, the dramatic one, the city everyone name drops when they want to sound ominous, sinful, or historically impressive at a dinner party. This is not an exciting story. This is a long, gently meandering, mildly judgmental bedtime walk through ancient imperial dysfunction. Nothing jumps out, nothing screams. Things mostly just happen, very slowly, as they tend to do when written by tired scribes with sore wrists and questionable sources. So get comfortable, because Babylon takes its time. Babylon begins like most ancient cities do, near a river, because humans love rivers. They provide water, food, trade, and the comforting illusion that civilization is a good idea. In this case, the river was the Euphrates, wide, muddy, moody, the kind of river that floods just often enough to keep everyone anxious but hopeful. By around 2300 BCE, Babylon was fine. Not great, not terrible, just another Mesopotamian city doing Mesopotamian things, growing barley, arguing about grain storage, writing extremely detailed lists of livestock. At this point, Babylon was not special, which is always how these stories start. A city minding its own business, unaware it will one day be blamed for the moral decay of Western civilization. The real glow-up began under Hammurabi. Yes, that Hammurabi, the law guy, the stone tablet enthusiast. Hammurabi ruled in the 18th century BCE and decided Babylon deserved rules, lots of them, very specific ones. If you knock out someone's tooth, guess what happens next? Spoiler, it involves your tooth. These laws weren't exactly gentle, but they were clear, and clarity was fashionable. Hammurabi also did something important. He made Babylon the capital of a growing empire. Suddenly, Babylon wasn't just another river town, it was the place, where decisions happened, where gods were consulted, where paperwork mysteriously multiplied. After Hammurabi died, Babylon did what empires often do when the competent adult leaves the room. It wobbled. It got invaded. It got conquered. It got passed around like a particularly valuable but inconvenient heirloom. The Hittites showed up, then the Kassites. Everyone had a turn. And yet, Babylon endured, which is impressive. Cities usually get tired after a few centuries of being conquered. Babylon just sighed and kept going. By the time we reach the Neo-Babylonian period, around the 7th century BCE, Babylon was back, very back, architecturally smug, politically confident, spiritually dramatic. This is when Babylon leaned hard into aesthetics. Massive walls, wide processional roads, glazed blue bricks that screamed, "Yes, we are wealthy, and yes, you are impressed." And presiding over this renaissance was Nebuchadnezzar II, a man who did not suffer from modesty. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BCE and spent most of his reign building things, conquering things, and commissioning inscriptions about himself doing those things. If Babylon had a PR department, Nebuchadnezzar was the department. He rebuilt temples, expanded walls, renovated palaces, and, according to later writers, possibly built a set of gardens so excessive they became legendary, the Hanging Gardens, which is where things start getting fuzzy. Because here's the thing, no Babylonian text explicitly mentions the Hanging Gardens. Not one. No bragging inscription, no receipt, no annoyed accountant complaining about the water bill, which is suspicious. Nebuchadnezzar wrote about everything. If he invented a new brick shape, he carved it into stone. And yet, silence. The Hanging Gardens appear instead in Greek and Roman accounts written centuries later. Writers like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, who loved a good story and were absolutely not above embellishment. According to them, the gardens were built to comfort Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytas. She was supposedly homesick for the green hills of Media. Babylon, being flat and dusty, just wasn't doing it for her emotionally. So, Nebuchadnezzar, being the kind of husband who solves emotional problems with architecture, allegedly built a multi-tiered garden filled with trees, vines, and flowing water. Because nothing says I love you like an ancient hydraulic engineering nightmare. The gardens were described as terraced, lush, elevated, watered by some mysterious system that lifted river water upward against gravity. Already, historians were sweating. The word hanging is misleading. They didn't dangle, nothing swung. It's more like overhanging terraces, which is more catchy but more structurally sound. So, did they exist? Maybe, maybe not. Some scholars think the gardens were actually in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and later misattributed to Babylon because branding. Others think the gardens were real but temporary, a flex project, built, admired, then quietly abandoned. And some think the whole thing was a myth that grew legs because ancient people loved a list. The 7 wonders of the world needed something green. Babylon volunteered. What we do know is that Babylon itself was astonishing. The Ishtar Gate alone was enough to make visitors stop and stare. Towering, blue, covered in reliefs of lions and dragons, it screamed divine protection and imperial confidence. The processional way stretched through the city like a ceremonial runway. During festivals, statues of gods were paraded along it while citizens watched, prayed, and probably tried not to faint from the heat. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a stage, and Nebuchadnezzar loved being center stage. He expanded the palace complex until it became a maze of courtyards, halls, and administrative rooms. This wasn't cozy living, this was I rule the world, please get lost in my hallways living. Religion saturated everything. The god Marduk was Babylon's divine mascot, protector, creator, cosmic authority. At the center of it all stood the Ziggurat Etemanki, a massive stepped tower, possibly inspiring later stories about the Tower of Babel, a structure so tall and symbolic that people eventually decided it must represent human arrogance, which is fair. Have you seen empires? Life in Babylon wasn't all royal excess. Ordinary people lived packed into dense neighborhoods, mud brick houses, courtyards, families stacked on top of families. There were merchants, scribes, priests, brewers, bakers. Beer was a daily necessity. Water was risky. Beer was safe. Contracts were everywhere. Marriage contracts, adoption contracts, business contracts. Babylonians loved paperwork. Astrology flourished here too. The sky was watched obsessively. Stars weren't just pretty, they were messages, warnings, cosmic post-it notes from the gods. Babylonian astronomers tracked planets with eerie precision, not because they wanted science, but because they wanted to know who was about to have a bad day. And bad days came eventually. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire wobbled again. Kings followed who were less impressive, more erratic. One famously preferred religion tourism over governance. And then came Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, the Persians took Babylon, peacefully mostly, which honestly shocked everyone. Cyrus walked in, respected local customs, honored Marduk, and let everyone keep doing their thing. Babylon didn't burn, it transitioned. which is possibly the most Babylonian ending imaginable. No dramatic collapse, just a slow shift from center of the world to former center of the world. The city lingered. Alexander the Great later planned to make it his capital, then he died there instead. Classic Alexander. Over centuries, Babylon faded. The river shifted, the bricks were reused, the stories grew larger than the ruins, and somewhere in that haze, the Hanging Gardens either crumbled or were never there to begin with. But honestly, that almost feels fitting. A city remembered not just for what it was, but for what people wanted it to be. Lush, decadent, a little too confident. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into Nebuchadnezzar's personal life, his anxieties, his divine paranoia. All right, let's gently drift back in. Same slow pace, same dusty air, same faint sound of a river doing all the work while humans take the credit. We left Babylon standing tall, emotionally complicated, and maybe housing a suspiciously undocumented garden project. So now, let's linger a little longer with the man most often blamed or credited for all of it. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, builder of everything, champion of divine approval, and quietly a man who seemed deeply concerned that the gods were watching him at all times, which, to be fair, was kind of the job description. Nebuchadnezzar didn't wake up one day and casually become the most powerful man in Mesopotamia. He inherited momentum. His father, Nabopolassar, had already broken Babylon free from Assyrian domination. So Nebuchadnezzar stepped into a role that required constant proof of strength, proof of legitimacy, proof that Marduk was still very much on Team Babylon. And when ancient kings felt insecure, they didn't journal, they built. Nebuchadnezzar campaigned aggressively. The Levant, Judah, Phoenician cities. He laid sieges, he relocated populations, he brought skilled workers back to Babylon like souvenirs. This wasn't random cruelty, it was imperial efficiency, unsettling but systematic. Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, elites were exiled, and Babylon absorbed yet another layer of cultural complexity, which meant more gods, more rituals, more omens to worry about. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was spiritually crowded. The king himself was deeply religious, not the casual, symbolic kind, the anxious kind. Every inscription reads like a man desperately reminding the gods that he's doing his best. I rebuilt your temple. I restored your walls. I used the finest bricks. Please don't curse my descendants. There is a lot of please energy. And this brings us back to the gardens. Because if the Hanging Gardens existed, they weren't just a romantic gesture. They were a cosmic insurance policy. Water was sacred. Plants symbolized life. Elevation brought things closer to the divine. A garden that defied climate and gravity? That's not decoration, that's theology. If Amytis really was homesick, and that part is still debated, then Nebuchadnezzar's solution also conveniently screamed, "Look, gods, I can recreate nature itself," which is a bold claim. Historically, the gods do not love that. The engineering alone would have been exhausting. Water had to be lifted continuously from the Euphrates, possibly via chain pumps or screw-like mechanisms, powered by laborers who definitely did not get their names carved into stone. The terraces would have required waterproofing with bitumen and lead. Roots are destructive, water leaks, gardens rot buildings from the inside out. This wasn't sustainable serenity, this was a high-maintenance flex. Which might explain why, if the gardens existed, they didn't last long enough for Babylonian scribes to bother writing about them. They were impressive, then impractical, then quietly ignored. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar's mental state didn't exactly stabilize. Later traditions, especially biblical ones, paint him as increasingly erratic. Dreams plagued him, omens unsettled him, prophets irritated him. One famous story describes him losing his sanity entirely, living like an animal for years. Modern historians see this as symbolic or exaggerated, but even without the drama, the picture is clear. Nebuchadnezzar ruled a vast empire held together by belief. Belief in gods, belief in power, belief that the walls would always hold. That's a lot of pressure. And Babylon, for all its glory, was fragile. Its wealth depended on trade routes. Its agriculture depended on river management. Its unity depended on constant reinforcement. The city was brilliant, but it was also tired. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, he left behind a masterpiece and no equally capable successor. His son, Amel-Marduk, ruled briefly. He released prisoners, he offended elites, he got assassinated, which was not ideal. After that came a parade of short reigns and political drama, court intrigue, religious disputes, power struggles. And then, eventually, Nabonidus. Nabonidus is a lot. He was deeply devoted to the moon god Sin, which would have been fine if Babylon wasn't officially Team Marduk. He neglected festivals, he left Babylon for years, he upset priests, he confused everyone. This is never good for empire stability. While Nabonidus was off on spiritual retreats, Babylon simmered. The people grumbled, the elites plotted. So when Cyrus of Persia arrived, Babylon didn't exactly resist. The gates were opened, the priests supported him, and Marduk, conveniently, approved. Babylon fell without the dramatic destruction people expect, which is probably why it faded from memory in such a strange way. It wasn't conquered into rubble, it was absorbed, repurposed, politely sidelined. Under Persian rule, Babylon remained important, but it wasn't the center anymore. And without constant royal obsession, the city slowly lost its glow. The gardens, if they existed, would have needed constant upkeep. Without a king obsessed with divine landscaping, they would have dried out, collapsed, returned to dust. Which is oddly comforting, because Babylon's legacy wasn't meant to be permanent. It was meant to be impressive in its moment, and moments pass. Over time, writers romanticized it. Greek historians marveled, Roman authors exaggerated, medieval scholars moralized. Babylon became a symbol of excess, of arrogance, of humanity reaching too high, which is ironic considering how careful, anxious, and ritual-bound its rulers actually were. They weren't reckless dreamers, they were exhausted managers trying to keep the gods happy. The Hanging Gardens, real or not, fit perfectly into that mindset, an impossible project built to soothe homesickness, divine scrutiny, and royal insecurity all at once. A green miracle in a brown world. And then, gone. In the next part, we'll drift away from Nebuchadnezzar himself and follow the long afterlife of Babylon's reputation, how later cultures misunderstood it, feared it, and blamed it for things that really weren't its fault. For now, just let the image fade. Water lifting slowly, leaves rustling in dry air, a king standing somewhere hoping the gods are watching. We'll continue soon. All right, settle back in. Nothing new is about to happen quickly. We're just letting time stretch. Centuries sliding past like sand you don't bother brushing off. Babylon is no longer the center of the world, but it is very much the center of everyone's imagination, which, historically, is when things get weird. After the Persians took over, Babylon remained inhabited. People lived there, prayed there, filed paperwork there. It just wasn't the main character anymore. And cities, much like former celebrities, don't always handle that well. Under Persian rule, Babylon was respected but watched. It rebelled a few times. The Persians responded by removing walls, temples, symbols of autonomy. Nothing dramatic, just slow administrative suffocation. Then came Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. He marched in, admired everything, and immediately decided Babylon should be his capital. Because, of course he did. Babylon was ancient, symbolic, strategically placed, and dramatic enough to suit his self-image. He planned renovations, restorations. He wanted to bring it back. Then he died there instead, at 32, probably of fever, possibly of exhaustion, definitely of being Alexander. After that, Babylon entered its long twilight. The Seleucids founded new cities nearby. Trade routes shifted. The Euphrates wandered. People dismantled Babylon brick by brick, literally. Mud brick doesn't last. You reuse it. You rebuild elsewhere. By the 1st century BCE, Babylon was mostly ruins, still known, still referenced, but no longer alive. And this is where mythology takes over completely. In Jewish texts, Babylon becomes the symbol of exile, loss, oppression. Which makes sense. That experience was real. But over time, Babylon stopped being a city and started being a concept. In Christian tradition, it turned into shorthand for decadence, moral decay, urban sin. Babylon became a vibe. Never mind that actual Babylonians were deeply religious, law-obsessed, and terrified of divine punishment. Never mind the paperwork. In the book of Revelation, Babylon is rebranded as a cosmic villain, a metaphor for Rome, or empire in general, or whatever power people currently disliked. The city itself, long gone. Medieval writers imagined Babylon as a place of constant indulgence, endless feasts, gold everywhere, probably wine fountains, which again is generous. Archaeologists, much later, found something much quieter, structured, practical, but myths are louder than ruins. The Hanging Gardens benefited from this too. They became more elaborate with every retelling, more terraces, more exotic plants, more impossible engineering, because absence invites exaggeration. If no one can check, you might as well go big. By the 1st century BCE, Babylon was mostly ruins, still known, still referenced, but no longer alive. And this is where the strange emotional afterlife of Babylon takes over. A city that became everything people needed it to be. A warning, a villain, a wonder, a metaphor. Rarely a real place. Babylon's actual residents fade into the background. The brewers, the scribes, the families living in narrow houses, the priests arguing over calendars. They don't get legends, but they lived full lives, slow ones, measured by floods and festivals, which feels fitting for tonight, because Babylon isn't exciting when you look closely. It's methodical, bureaucratic, human. And the Hanging Gardens, whether real or imagined, tell us more about us than about them. We want ancient people to have been dramatic geniuses. We want miracles. We want romance. But most of history is maintenance. Cleaning canals, rebuilding walls, appeasing gods. Babylon did that well, for a long time. In the next part, we'll zoom out even further. We'll compare Babylon's imagined gardens to other royal coping mechanisms across history, because Babylon was not the last time someone thought landscaping could solve existential dread. For now, Let the ruins rest. Wind through broken bricks, stars overhead, still being watched. We'll drift on soon. All right, let's keep drifting. No sharp turns, no dramatic revelations, just a slow, sleepy slide across time, watching powerful people repeatedly decide that plants will fix everything. Because Babylon was not alone in this, not even close. The Hanging Gardens, real, imagined, or emotionally aspirational, fit into a very long tradition of rulers using architecture and landscaping as therapy. And honestly, relatable. When you have unlimited resources and unresolved anxiety, you don't talk it out. You commission a project. So let's gently float outward from Babylon and notice how often this happens. Persian kings, for example, loved gardens, loved them deeply, obsessively. The very word paradise comes from the Old Persian paridesa, meaning enclosed garden, which tells you everything. Persian royal gardens were orderly, symmetrical, water flowing in perfect channels. This wasn't just decoration, it was ideology. The king stood at the center of a perfectly controlled natural world. Chaos pushed outside the walls, order inside, which is what every anxious ruler wants. Cyrus the Great, who took Babylon so politely, was famous for respecting local traditions, but he also quietly replaced chaos with administration. Gardens followed that logic. Nature, but supervised. Later Persian rulers expanded this idea until it became imperial branding. If Babylon's gardens were about reassurance, Persian gardens were about control. You weren't meant to feel relaxed, you were meant to feel impressed. Then we move west. Egyptian pharaohs also enjoyed gardens, though they preferred theirs symbolic. Lotus ponds, palm-lined paths, sacred trees. These weren't sprawling leisure spaces, they were religious diagrams. Everything had meaning, nothing was random. Pharaohs didn't relax in gardens, they posed in them. And when a ruler posed long enough, people eventually started telling stories about how serene and godlike they were. Which brings us back to the problem of myth. Gardens don't preserve well, stories do. Jump forward a bit, and Rome enters the chat. Roman elites loved gardens, loved them too much. Villa gardens, urban gardens, courtyard gardens with carefully framed views. The Romans imported plants from across the empire, exotic flowers, rare trees. Owning something that didn't belong there was the point. Emperors competed through landscaping. Who had the rarest plants, the longest water features, the most artificial nature? Nero famously built the Domus Aurea, a palace so absurd it included rotating dining rooms and artificial lakes. Was it peaceful? No. Was it excessive? Absolutely. Was it emotionally grounded? Not even a little. And yet, centuries later, people would whisper about it in awe. Because again, ruins invite imagination. By the medieval period, gardens became enclosed, quiet, symbolic. Monastic gardens were about contemplation, order in a chaotic world, but royal gardens, still about power, still about proving you could command growth, still about pretending that the universe was cooperating. Which brings us to an important realization. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon didn't need to exist physically to exist culturally. They represented something timeless, the desire to build calm instead of cultivating it internally. And Nebuchadnezzar fits this perfectly. Here was a king who ruled through conquest, devotion, and constant construction, a man who feared divine displeasure, who feared disorder, who feared being forgotten. So he built walls, temples, palaces, and maybe a garden. Or maybe the idea of one was enough, because even in ancient times, reputation mattered. Greek writers heard stories, travelers exaggerated. Babylon became larger in memory than it ever was in stone. And once a story reaches that point, it stops needing evidence. which is why the hanging gardens persist, not because we've proven them, but because we like them. They soften Babylon's image. Instead of just laws, conquests, and exile, we get leaves, water, shade. We get a story where power pauses to care, even if that care required an entire workforce and constant maintenance. And honestly, that contradiction feels very human. Babylon was a city obsessed with order, divinity, and survival. Its rulers didn't want chaos. They wanted permanence. Gardens promise permanence. They rarely deliver it, which is maybe why the idea lasted longer than the thing ever could. As centuries passed, travelers stood among ruins and tried to imagine the past. They saw broken walls and thought of towers. They saw dust and imagined green. And each retelling added another layer. By the time archaeology entered the scene, the story was already complete. It didn't need correction, it needed preservation. So historians argue, engineers calculate, scholars debate irrigation systems. But the public? The public just wants the gardens. And there's nothing wrong with that. Because at the end of the day, Babylon wasn't just bricks. It was longing. Longing for order, for divine approval, for memory. The hanging gardens capture that better than any wall. In the next part, we'll return briefly to the people who would have actually lived under those terraces, if they existed at all. The workers, the gardeners, the ones whose backs powered the dream. Because every royal coping mechanism rests on someone else doing the lifting. For now, let the leaves sway. Let the water keep flowing upward somehow, and stay right here, half awake, as we continue our very slow walk through the most overimagined city in history.
All right, still with me? Good. Nothing strenuous ahead, just a gentle lowering of perspective. Because so far, Babylon has been all kings, gods, and hypothetical terraces, which is how history usually introduces itself, from the top, from the loudest voices, from people who carved their names into stone. But if the hanging gardens existed, even briefly, they didn't water themselves. So let's slowly step away from the palace balcony and wander downward, past the polished bricks, past the ceremonial spaces, toward the people who made everything function while receiving exactly zero credit. These were not gardeners in the modern sense, no leisurely pruning, no poetic relationship with nature. This was labor. Babylonian workers were organized, categorized, and recorded. Everything was counted: rations, workdays, assignments. If you moved water for a living, your life was scheduled by clay tablet. Water management in Mesopotamia was serious business. Canals required constant maintenance, silt built up, banks collapsed, floods arrived uninvited. Now imagine adding a vertical garden into that system. If water truly flowed upward to terraces, someone had to power that motion, likely enslaved laborers or conscripted workers. They would have worked in shifts, endlessly turning mechanisms, hauling, maintaining pressure. Quiet work, repetitive work, not romantic. The plants themselves would have required constant care, roots trimmed, soil replaced, drainage monitored. A garden at that scale isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. And responsibility, in empires, travels downhill. Babylonian society was layered. At the top, king, family, high priests. Below them, officials, scribes, merchants. Then skilled laborers, then unskilled laborers, then enslaved people. Most people lived close to subsistence. They ate barley bread, drank beer, worked until festivals gave them a break. Their homes were small, functional, built around courtyards to manage heat. No terraces, no shade trees. So if a lush garden rose above the city, it would have been visible, a reminder of distance. Beauty, but unreachable. And yet, that's how royal spaces always work. They're not meant to be shared, they're meant to be seen. Babylonian kings staged themselves carefully. Public rituals showed generosity, but access remained controlled. Even the processional way wasn't for wandering, it was for spectacle. So the hanging gardens, if they existed, were probably private, seen from below, admired from afar, which makes the later romanticization even more ironic. This wasn't a communal park, this was elite reassurance. Still, for the people maintaining it, it was just another job. Ancient texts describe workers assigned to temples and palaces. They received rations instead of wages, grain, oil, sometimes clothing. Their days blended together. Turn the mechanism, check the channels, replace a plant that didn't survive. And if something failed, that wasn't symbolic. That was dangerous. Failure meant displeasing the king, and worse, displeasing the gods. Because in Babylon, nothing was neutral. A wilting plant could be interpreted as an omen, a crack in a wall could be a warning, which meant constant vigilance. So while later writers imagined serenity, the reality was probably tense. Maintenance is never peaceful, and maintenance was Babylon's true genius. The city functioned because people showed up every day and did their tasks without fanfare. Scribes tracked everything, priests observed everything, workers sustained everything. The hanging gardens, if real, were just one more system layered onto an already complex city, and complexity always carries risk, which may explain why the idea outlived the object. Once the empire weakened, anything non-essential would have been abandoned first. Walls matter, temples matter, gardens, not so much. So they fade. Plants die, mechanisms rust, terraces crumble, workers move on, and memory takes over. What survives isn't the labor, it's the image, a green miracle, a loving gesture, a wonder. No one remembers the calloused hands, which is consistent. Babylon itself suffered the same fate. Its people disappeared into history. Its name became a symbol. And symbols don't need workers. They just need repetition. So centuries later, artists painted gardens no one had seen, poets described shade no one had felt, historians debated engineering no one could confirm. Meanwhile, the real Babylon sat quietly beneath the soil, waiting. In the next part, we'll let ourselves drift into that modern rediscovery, the archaeologists, the trenches, the moment when myth met mud, because even legends eventually get excavated. For now, just rest here. The water wheel turns, someone replaces a broken brick, the garden, real or imagined, keeps demanding attention, and history keeps humming along, unimpressed but patient. All right, let's keep going. Same pace, same soft focus. We're many centuries away from Nebuchadnezzar now, and Babylon has been quiet for a long time. Grass grows where walls once stood. Villages reuse old bricks. Travelers pass by without realizing what they're standing on. And then, slowly, humans do that thing where they get curious again. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars were deeply invested in the ancient world. Not always for the right reasons, but curiosity counts for something. They read Greek texts, biblical passages, Roman histories, and Babylon loomed large, a city of wonders, a city of arrogance, a city of a garden that shouldn't have worked. So they went looking. Early explorers didn't have advanced tools. They had notebooks, shovels, and confidence. A lot of confidence. They wandered Mesopotamia, asking locals about ruins, digging wherever something looked promising. Often they found bricks stamped with royal names. Nebuchadnezzar loved stamping bricks. It was his version of branding. So Babylon began to reemerge, slowly, messily. Walls were uncovered, gates reconstructed, street layouts mapped, and yet still no garden. No massive substructure, no irrigation network large enough to support a hanging forest, which didn't stop people from insisting it must be there, because absence is inconvenient. Some archaeologists proposed locations within the palace complex. Others suggested nearby areas. Each theory came with diagrams, careful measurements, polite academic disagreements. Very calm, very unresolved. Then, in the late 20th century, a new idea gained traction. Maybe the Hanging Gardens weren't in Babylon at all. Maybe they were in Nineveh. This theory pointed to Assyrian texts describing elaborate gardens built by King Sennacherib, gardens with advanced irrigation, aqueducts, detailed inscriptions bragging about water being lifted like a miracle. And suddenly, things clicked. Because unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib did write about his gardens, in detail, with pride, and Nineveh fits the engineering better. So what happened? Possibly a case of ancient misattribution. Greek writers heard about incredible gardens in Mesopotamia. They associated them with Babylon, the most famous city they knew. Over time, the details merged. Babylon absorbed the story, which happens constantly. History is less like a filing system and more like a rumor mill. Still, even with this explanation, the myth didn't fade, because Babylon felt right. It had the vibe, and for most people, that's enough. Archaeology, meanwhile, kept digging. They found homes, temples, administrative buildings, evidence of daily life, receipts, letters, complaints. One tablet includes someone annoyed about poor quality copper, which is comforting. Some things never change. What they didn't find was extravagance for extravagance's sake. Babylon wasn't reckless, it was calculated, which again makes the garden feel out of character. Not impossible, just unlikely. And yet, here we are, still talking about it, because modern audiences don't crave accuracy as much as atmosphere. The Hanging Gardens offer atmosphere. They soften Babylon's image. They add romance. They let us imagine ancient people pausing to admire beauty, which they probably did, just not on gravity-defying terraces. So today, textbooks hedge, museums explain uncertainty, documentaries love dramatic reenactments, lost wonder, ancient mystery. Could it have existed? The answer remains maybe. And maybe is powerful because it leaves room for imagination without demanding belief. Babylon's ruins sit quietly in modern Iraq. They've been damaged by war, neglect, reconstruction attempts. History doesn't rest easily. The site has suffered looting, rebuilding, mismanagement, which is sadly fitting. Babylon has always been more useful as an idea than as a place. The Hanging Gardens fit that pattern perfectly. They exist best when no one touches them. So we let them float, somewhere between myth and memory, between desire and evidence. A garden that tells us more about longing than logistics. In the next part, we'll slow down even more. We'll reflect on why stories like this endure, why we keep wanting ancient greatness to be gentle. For now, just breathe. The archaeologist brushes dust from a brick. The inscription fades. The garden stays green, only in the mind. And that's probably where it was always meant to live. All right, we're still here. Still moving at the speed of drifting thoughts at 2 a.m. Nothing urgent, nothing sharp. By now, Babylon has been excavated, argued over, footnoted, and politely disagreed with. And yet, the Hanging Gardens refuse to go away, which tells us something important. Not about Babylon, about us. Because if this were just about evidence, the story would have ended quietly in an academic journal somewhere around the mid-20th century. No conclusive proof, possibly misattributed. Engineering, unlikely. End of discussion. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Hanging Gardens became one of the most stubborn ideas in ancient history. They linger in textbooks. They show up in documentaries with soft music and slow drone shots. They get illustrated over and over again, usually at sunset. We keep rebuilding them in our heads. And the reason is simple. They make power feel gentle. Babylon, without the gardens, is impressive but intimidating. Its laws carved in stone, its deportations, its massive walls and divine judgment. Add the gardens, and suddenly the empire has a softer side, a homesick queen, a thoughtful king, a moment of tenderness amid conquest. It's emotionally convenient. We like our ancient giants to have a heart. And the Hanging Gardens let us believe that even the most bureaucratic, ritual-obsessed empire paused to appreciate beauty, even if that pause required enslaved labor and constant maintenance. We don't dwell on that part. Another reason the story persists is contrast. Babylon was dry, hot, dusty. A lush garden rising above it feels miraculous. Humans love contrast, especially visual contrast. A desert with green terraces is easier to remember than a well-managed canal system. And then there's the list, the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Lists are powerful. Once something makes a list, it becomes immortal. Questioning it feels like cheating. And the list needed variety. You couldn't have 7 piles of stone. You needed something alive. So the Hanging Gardens filled that role perfectly. They added color, movement, life. Never mind that they were the only wonder whose location was never confirmed. That just made them more intriguing. Mystery is a feature, not a flaw. And finally, there's longing. The Hanging Gardens are about bringing one landscape into another, mountains into plains, green into brown, home into exile. That resonates, especially in a world where displacement was common, and still is. If Amethyst existed, and if she was homesick, then the garden becomes an act of emotional translation, a reminder that power can't erase longing, it can only try to decorate over it. That idea feels timeless, which is probably why we forgive the lack of evidence. We don't need the garden to be real, we need it to be meaningful. And it is. It tells us that even ancient empires imagined peace as something cultivated, something grown slowly, something fragile. That's comforting, even if it's fictional. Babylon itself has always existed in that in-between space, part history, part warning, part projection. Every generation reinterprets it. To some, it's tyranny. To others, decadence. To others, lost brilliance. The Hanging Gardens slide easily into all of those interpretations. They can be generosity or excess, love or vanity, genius or hubris. They're flexible, which is why they endure. And maybe that's the quiet genius of the story. It never demands certainty. It just asks you to imagine water flowing upward, leaves growing where they shouldn't, a city trying, briefly, to be kind. In the next part, we'll let ourselves drift toward the end of Babylon's long echo, what remains when even the myths grow tired. But for now, stay here. The garden hums softly in the background. Not real, not gone, just suspended. And sometimes that's the most restful place to be. All right, we're nearing the quiet end of this long drift. Not an ending with closure, just a soft thinning out, like sound traveling farther than it should, then finally deciding it's done. Babylon, by now, exists almost entirely in reference, not as a city you visit, not as a place people live, but as a word people use. And words, once detached from places, do strange things. They stretch, they blur, they absorb whatever the speaker needs. By late antiquity, Babylon was no longer remembered for its markets or canals, it was remembered for meaning. The physical city kept eroding. Wind, water, reuse. Mud brick returns to mud. But Babylon, the idea, kept accumulating layers. Church writers invoked it when warning against pride. Poets used it when describing moral collapse. Empire critics reached for it instinctively. If something felt too big, too confident, too certain of itself, it became Babylon, which is unfair but consistent. The hanging gardens floating somewhere in that mental landscape became less architectural and more emotional. They stopped being a construction project and started being a symbol of lost balance. Nature elevated, harmony attempted, order briefly achieved, and then lost, which mirrors how people felt about the ancient world in general. There's a quiet sadness baked into how we talk about antiquity, a sense that people once knew something we forgot or had something we can't recover. The gardens slot neatly into that sadness. They weren't destroyed in a fire. They weren't toppled by invaders. They just vanished, like calm does, which makes them easy to mourn. Modern visitors to the ruins of Babylon often describe disappointment, not because the site lacks importance, but because it doesn't match the image. There's no towering garden, no dramatic height, just foundations, fragments, wide, quiet space, which is honestly what most real places look like once the stories leave. And maybe that's the point. The hanging gardens aren't something you can stand in. They're something you imagine while standing somewhere else. They exist best when you're tired, when you're receptive, when you're willing to let uncertainty be soothing instead of frustrating. They're a bedtime story disguised as history, and Babylon itself has become the same. We no longer argue about its taxes or grain quotas. We argue about what it meant, which is what happens when practical details finally lose their grip. So what remains? A river that still flows, though it's changed course, bricks stamped with royal names, a gate reconstructed in a museum far away, and a garden that may never have existed but somehow refuses to die. That's not failure. That's success of a different kind. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what people carry forward. And people carried Babylon forward as a caution, a marvel, and a dream. The hanging gardens sit gently at the center of that dream. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly implausible, which makes them perfect for this moment, as we let Babylon finally settle. No conquest, no revelation, just the sense of something vast slowly exhaling. In the next part, our final stretch, we'll let go completely. We'll stop asking whether the gardens were real, and instead we'll sit with why that question mattered in the first place. For now, rest. The last echo fades, the city sleeps, and somewhere, still, water rises upward in the dark, only because we want it. All right, this is the last stretch. No conclusions to wrestle with, no answers to lock in place, just a gentle loosening of the grip. By now, Babylon has done what most ancient cities eventually do. It stopped being something you study and started being something you feel. And the hanging gardens, real, misplaced, exaggerated, or entirely imagined, have followed the same path. So let's stop interrogating them. No more engineering diagrams, no more arguments about irrigation screws, no more academic footnotes clearing their throats. Instead, let's just sit with the idea. A city built on mud and law, a king trying very hard to be remembered correctly, a story that insists beauty once rose where it shouldn't have. Because that's really what this has been about the whole time. Not whether trees can grow on terraces, they can. Not whether water can be lifted upward, it can. But whether power ever pauses long enough to build something unnecessary, something not strictly useful, something fragile. Babylon, in reality, was practical almost to a fault. Its survival depended on systems working smoothly, canals flowing, calendars aligning, gods being acknowledged in the correct order. It didn't have much room for whimsy, which is why the hanging gardens feel so out of place and so appealing. They represent the thing Babylon didn't have time for: rest, shade, a view that wasn't about control. And maybe that's why later generations added them in. Because when people look back at empires, they don't want to see spreadsheets and ration lists. They want to believe that even at the height of power, someone looked out over the city and thought, this could be nicer. So they imagined a garden, terraced, green, quiet. They imagined water moving without urgency, plants growing without being harvested immediately. They imagined care without accounting. And then they attached that image to Babylon, because Babylon was already carrying the weight of excess and meaning. It could handle one more story. The hanging gardens don't survive because they're true. They survive because they're merciful. They forgive Babylon a little. They soften it. They say, yes, this city conquered and controlled, but maybe it also tried to comfort. And even if that comfort only existed in hindsight, that's still telling. Because history isn't just a record of what happened, it's a negotiation between what did happen and what we need to believe happened. Babylon became a mirror. Every era looked into it and saw something different: fear, arrogance, grandeur, loss. And somewhere in that reflection, a garden kept appearing. So maybe the most honest way to end this isn't with certainty. It's with acceptance. The hanging gardens might not have existed in Babylon, but the desire they represent definitely did. The desire to soften power, to humanize scale, to believe that even the most overwhelming systems had moments of gentleness. That desire hasn't gone anywhere. We still build parks in cities, still plant trees along concrete, still try to make space livable instead of just functional. Every rooftop garden is a small echo of Babylon's imagined one, and that's kind of beautiful. So let's leave Babylon now, not as ruins, not as a warning to be proven, but as a slow, quiet thought. A city that once was, a garden that maybe wasn't, and a story that continues because we're still telling it. Let the river keep flowing, let the dust settle, and let yourself drift off knowing that even in the oldest stories we have, people were already dreaming of shade. Good night. All right, we're going to keep going, because history never actually stops where we say it does. It just gets quieter, and people mistake that for an ending. So if you thought part 9 wrapped things up neatly, that was just your brain asking for permission to rest. We're not quite done yet. Babylon has one more habit worth lingering on. It refuses to stay buried. Even after the myths settle, even after the gardens dissolve into metaphor, even after the city becomes a cautionary word whispered by monks and preachers, someone always comes back and says, but what if? And that's where Babylon quietly re-enters modern history. In the 20th century, Babylon stopped being just an ancient ruin. It became a project again. Not in the careful archaeological sense, in the ambitious, slightly anxious, very human sense. Governments noticed Babylon. Leaders noticed Babylon. And predictably, some of them saw themselves in it, which is never a great sign. Reconstruction efforts began. Walls were rebuilt, not always accurately. Streets were relaid, sometimes with concrete. Archaeologists winced, but the impulse was familiar. Rebuild the symbol, reclaim the greatness, restore the narrative. Babylon has always attracted people who want legitimacy to feel ancient. Nebuchadnezzar stamped his name on bricks. Modern rulers did the same thing, just with plaques and press releases. The city became a stage again, not for gods this time, for national identity, which sounds noble until you realize it repeats the same old pattern. Babylon keeps being used as a mirror, and mirrors don't care who's looking. The ruins suffered. Heavy equipment damaged ancient layers. Reconstructions obscured original structures. History got smoothed out, which is ironic given how much we claim to value authenticity. But authenticity is inconvenient. Symbols are easier. And Babylon, once again, served the symbol. The Hanging Gardens didn't reappear physically, but their spirit did. Green spaces were planned. Tourism imagery leaned heavily on lush reconstructions. The old fantasy crept back in. Because even in the modern world, we still want Babylon to be beautiful. Not just important, not just old, beautiful. And that tells us something quietly uncomfortable. We don't actually want history as it was. We want history as comfort. We want it to reassure us that greatness included softness, that power included care. So we keep repainting the past until it feels livable. Babylon is especially vulnerable to this because it left such a strong outline. Big walls, big laws, big reputation. It invites embellishment. Which brings us back, gently, almost lazily, to the Hanging Gardens. They don't need proof because they serve a purpose. They say, even here, even in the most overwhelming city imaginable, someone wanted shade. That idea is hard to give up, and maybe we shouldn't, because even if the gardens weren't real, the impulse behind them absolutely was. Babylonians managed water obsessively. They cared deeply about order and balance. They believed chaos was always one mistake away. So wanting greenery, controlled, elevated, protected, fits perfectly. It just might not have looked like the postcards. And that's okay. History doesn't need to be cinematic to be meaningful. Most of it is maintenance, waiting, repeating, which is exactly what we're doing here, just waiting together. In the next part, we'll slow down even more and let Babylon fade into a broader pattern, how ancient cities become emotional furniture in the human mind. Nothing dramatic, just quiet continuity. Stay right here. All right, still drifting. No rush. No destination that needs arriving at on time. At this point, Babylon isn't really a city anymore. It's furniture. The kind you don't actively look at, but always notice when it's gone. Ancient cities like Babylon settle into the human mind the same way old chairs do into a room. They stop being objects of attention and start being things you lean on. You reference them casually. You use them metaphorically. You expect them to be there. Babylon becomes shorthand for excess, for ambition, for hubris, for collapse. And occasionally, if you're feeling generous, for brilliance. That's a heavy load for one place to carry, but Babylon has been carrying it for a very long time. And the Hanging Gardens? They're the cushion. They soften the edges. They make the whole thing more livable. Because without them, Babylon is all angles and warnings, all stone and judgment. With them, Babylon breathes. And humans prefer breathing metaphors. This is something that happens to many ancient cities. Athens becomes reason. Rome becomes power. Jerusalem becomes faith. Babylon becomes everything people are nervous about. So naturally, people want to give it something gentle. A garden. Not a battlefield, not a courtroom, not a ziggurat looming over the skyline. A place where things grow slowly. Which is funny because growth was never Babylon's problem. Babylon grew very well. It expanded, it absorbed cultures, it standardized systems. What it struggled with was restraint. Gardens symbolize restraint. You don't force a garden, you guide it.
At least, that's the story we tell ourselves. So Babylon, the city of laws and control, gets paired with a garden it may never have had. And over time, people stop questioning it because it feels right. When modern writers talk about lost wonders, they linger on Babylon. When artists imagine ancient luxury, they paint Babylon green. When filmmakers need a backdrop for ancient grandeur, Babylon shows up, conveniently covered in vines. It's visual shorthand, and shorthand is efficient, which is ironic given how inefficient the Hanging Gardens would have been. But that irony gets lost, because once a city becomes emotional furniture, accuracy becomes secondary. What matters is how it supports the weight of our thinking. Babylon supports a lot. It holds our fears about civilization collapsing under its own complexity. It holds our guilt about excess. It holds our longing for a past that feels both grand and humane. The Hanging Gardens hold that longing especially well. They suggest that ancient people weren't just obsessed with power. They also wanted comfort. They weren't just managing empires, they were managing homesickness. And even if that's not literally true, it's psychologically true. Every empire contains people who miss somewhere else. Babylon was no different. So the gardens don't need to be proven. They just need to exist in the right emotional spot. And they do. Which is why even now you'll find them in children's books, in travel posters, in quiet history channels playing at midnight. They're safe. They don't demand outrage or awe. They invite slow imagining. Which brings us full circle, because this entire story, the gardens, the myths, the uncertainty, is best consumed slowly, not as a revelation, as a hum. Babylon hums. It doesn't shout anymore. And maybe that's the most honest way to remember it. In the next part, we'll let ourselves drift even farther outward. We'll look at Babylon not as a city, not as a symbol, but as part of a very old human habit. The habit of telling ourselves that power once knew how to be beautiful. Nothing sharp, nothing dramatic, just the continuation of the drift. Stay right here. All right, settle in a little deeper. This one stretches out. No turns, no peaks, just a long, steady glide. Because Babylon isn't unique in this habit, it's just very good at it. Humans have always liked to look back at power and gently edit it. Not to erase the cruelty entirely, just to blur it enough that we can live with it. We do this constantly. We tell ourselves kings were wise, that emperors were cultured, that ancient elites spent at least some of their time thinking about beauty instead of control. And when the historical record doesn't cooperate, we add details. A garden helps. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon sit inside this habit like they were custom built for it, because they offer proof, imagined proof, that even the most intimidating systems had a softer interior, a place where no one was shouting orders, where growth happened slowly, where nothing needed to be conquered. Which is, of course, not how empires actually function. Empires function through pressure, through logistics, through extraction. Babylon was no exception. It ran on grain quotas, labor obligations, military campaigns. It ran on anxiety. The gods had to be appeased. The river had to be managed. The borders had to be defended. There was no time for sentimentality. And yet, sentimentality shows up anyway. Not in the records Babylon left behind, in the stories others told later, because distance changes tone. Once a civilization is gone, it stops threatening you. It becomes safe to romanticize. Babylon, long after its fall, became useful in a new way. It became a container. You could pour into it whatever lesson you wanted to teach. Greed leads to downfall. Pride invites punishment. Luxury weakens resolve. And once you've poured all that in, you're left with something heavy, something harsh. So you balance it. You add a garden. This happens again and again in history. Versailles is remembered for its fountains, not the hunger outside its gates. Rome is remembered for its baths, not its slave markets. The British Empire is remembered for railways, not famines. Gardens are always part of the edit. They're visual shorthand for civilization behaving itself. Babylon's hanging gardens play that role perfectly. They suggest refinement, taste, a pause. They say, this wasn't all brutality. And maybe that matters more to us than whether it's true. Because deep down, we're uncomfortable with the idea that power is mostly unkind. We'd rather believe it occasionally planted trees. So we let the gardens exist. We pass the story down. We don't question it too loudly. And eventually, it becomes tradition. But here's the quiet part. Even if the hanging gardens never existed, Babylon absolutely had moments of calm. Not the cinematic kind, the ordinary kind. Evenings when the heat softened, courtyards where families sat together, festivals where work stopped briefly. Real peace is rarely monumental. It doesn't get carved into stone. It doesn't end up on lists of wonders. It happens between tasks. Babylonian parents watched children play. Neighbors shared beer. Priests debated theology late into the night. Those moments mattered. They just weren't impressive enough for Greek historians. So, later generations invented something impressive, a garden large enough to be noticed, which tells us less about Babylon and more about us. We don't trust small peace. We want peace to be visible from a distance. We want it elevated, terraced, irrigated. We want it to look like effort. So we imagine kings building gardens instead of imagining workers resting, because rest without spectacle feels undeserved. And this is where the hanging gardens become especially interesting. They are rest imagined by people who didn't have it. They are calm imagined by people living far from empire. They are beauty imagined by people who had never seen Babylon firsthand, which is why they're so lush. Imagination has better soil than reality. Babylon itself probably never looked the way we picture it. Not golden, not glowing, more beige, more busy, more paperwork. And yet, that's not what survives. What survives is the image of water moving upward against gravity, because that's how we want history to work. We want it to rise above itself. We want it to contradict what we know about human behavior. We want proof that power sometimes chose gentleness. The hanging gardens offer that proof without asking questions, which makes them ideal. So the story persists, quietly, patiently, waiting for tired minds to wander back to it, which is what we're doing now, just letting the idea stretch out. No need to defend it, no need to debunk it, just noticing what it does. And what it does is soften Babylon. That's the entire function. In the next part, we'll slow even further and watch how this softening repeats across cultures, eras, and ruins. Because Babylon didn't invent this habit, it just perfected it. Stay comfortable. We're in no hurry at all.
All right, still here, still moving slowly enough that time feels optional. By now, Babylon has drifted far enough away that it's no longer sharp. And that distance does something interesting to humans. It makes us gentle. Not accurate, not precise, gentle. When places are alive, we judge them harshly. We notice their flaws, their noise, their inefficiencies. When places become ruins, we forgive them. Babylon, while it functioned, was loud, crowded, regulated, anxious. Babylon, as a ruin, is quiet, empty, patient. And quiet things invite kindness. Archaeologists walk slowly through broken walls. Tourists lower their voices without being asked. Even people who know nothing about Babylon feel a strange respect standing near what's left. Ruins soften judgment, which is why stories about ruins soften too. The Hanging Gardens live comfortably in ruin space. They don't interrupt anything. They don't demand proof. They float above the broken bricks like a polite thought no one wants to challenge. And this isn't unique to Babylon. Every ancient ruin grows a halo over time. Machu Picchu becomes mystical. Angkor becomes serene. Pompeii becomes frozen elegance instead of a crowded, smelly port town that absolutely had garbage problems. We remove inconvenience from memory. We replace it with atmosphere. Babylon gets atmosphere in the form of a garden, a calm, green counterweight to laws and exile. And once a story serves that function, it becomes almost rude to question it. Why ruin a good image? Why take away the nice part? Which is fair emotionally, because ruins already feel like loss. People don't want additional subtraction. They want something to hold on to. The Hanging Gardens give them that. They say something beautiful was here, even if the evidence shrugs, and that's enough for most people. Babylon's physical remains don't argue. They just sit there. Cracked walls don't correct you. Broken bricks don't interrupt. Silence lets stories grow. Which is why ruins are such powerful collaborators in myth-making. They don't contradict, they allow. And Babylon allows a lot. It allows moral lessons, it allows warnings, it allows nostalgia for a world no one actually lived in. The Hanging Gardens fit neatly into that permission. They don't challenge anything, they don't complicate much. They just sit there, imagined, adding softness. And softness is rare in imperial history, which brings us back gently to the people who first told the story. Greek writers didn't see Babylon at its height. They encountered fragments, secondhand accounts, echoes. They filled gaps the way humans always do, with images that made sense to them. To a Greek audience, gardens were symbols of refinement, of leisure, of philosophical calm. So Babylon got gardens, not because it needed them historically, because it needed them narratively. And narratives are stubborn. Once they settle in, they don't leave easily, even when archaeology suggests otherwise. Because archaeology explains, narratives comfort, and comfort usually wins. Babylon's comfort story is that it wasn't just terrifying, it was also thoughtful, that it didn't just dominate, it also cultivated, that even in a place obsessed with order, someone wanted beauty. That idea doesn't hurt anyone, so we keep it. And when we retell it, we smooth the edges a little more. The gardens become quieter, greener, less labor-intensive. The workers disappear. The maintenance fades. All that remains is the image. And the image does exactly what it's supposed to do. It lets us like Babylon without endorsing it. It lets us admire without guilt, which is a useful trick when dealing with the past, because the past is heavy, and humans, historically, prefer light luggage. In the next part, we'll drift toward one final pattern: how stories like the Hanging Gardens show up again and again whenever people feel overwhelmed by complexity, not just in history, in cities, in systems, in everyday life. Nothing dramatic, just a slow recognition. Stay comfortable, we're still drifting. All right, still with me? Good. This part stretches out like a long, quiet afternoon where nothing needs to be solved. By now, Babylon has faded into a shape rather than a place, and that shape tells us something very consistent about humans. When life becomes too complex, we invent gardens. Not always literal ones. Sometimes they're ideas. sometimes stories, sometimes just mental images we return to when everything feels overly managed. Babylon was complexity layered on complexity. Legal codes, religious calendars, astronomical observations, economic systems. Everything was tracked, measured, accounted for. And that kind of world is impressive, but exhausting. So even if the Hanging Gardens never existed physically, the idea of them makes perfect psychological sense. They're an antidote to bureaucracy, a place where growth happens without permission slips, where water flows not because it was scheduled, but because it's supposed to, where time feels different. And humans have been creating versions of that antidote forever. Monastic cloisters, Persian paradise gardens, Roman villas, Chinese scholar gardens. All of them appear in moments of intense organization and pressure. They're not escapes from power, they're pressure valves inside it. Babylon's imagined garden fits neatly into that tradition. It says, yes, this city was overwhelming, but somewhere inside it there was calm. And that's a story people desperately want to hear when systems get big. Which is why the Hanging Gardens feel strangely modern. Today, cities are louder than ever, more regulated, more optimized. And what do we add? Parks, green roofs, vertical gardens. We literally recreate the Hanging Gardens concept and call it sustainable design. We plant trees on concrete towers and congratulate ourselves for remembering that humans need shade. And when we do it, we feel ancient, connected, as if we're tapping into something timeless. Because we are. The Hanging Gardens, real or not, express a very old truth. Complexity needs softness, or it becomes unbearable. Babylon understood complexity extremely well. It just didn't document softness in ways later cultures recognized. So later cultures filled in the gap. They added greenery. They added water. They added a story where power briefly stopped calculating and let something live. And once that story existed, it became reusable. Anytime a society feels too rigid, too mechanical, too distant from nature, the Hanging Gardens reappear. In architecture books, in urban planning lectures, in tired history documentaries playing late at night. They whisper the same thing. It doesn't have to be all stone, which is comforting, especially when stone feels permanent and people feel temporary. Babylon's stone didn't last. Neither did its laws. Neither did its gods. What lasted was the desire to soften systems, and that desire keeps reincarnating his gardens, sometimes literal, sometimes imaginary, which makes the Hanging Gardens one of the most successful ideas in history. Not because they existed, but because they keep being needed. They show up whenever people look at complexity and think, this is impressive, but I don't want to live inside it forever. So we imagine leaves, and we imagine water, and we imagine that somewhere, someone powerful enough decided beauty mattered, even if that decision was retroactively assigned. And that's okay, because stories aren't contracts, they're coping mechanisms. The Hanging Gardens cope with Babylon's intensity. They cope with empire itself. They let us believe that structure and softness can coexist, which is a belief worth holding on to, even if it's historically shaky. In the next part, we'll slow down even further and let this idea dissolve into something very quiet. How eventually even the need for gardens fades, and all that's left is the act of remembering. Nothing to analyze, nothing to debate. Just the long tail of memory doing what it does best. Stay right where you are. All right. No urgency. No conclusions waiting at the end of the page. By now, even the idea of Babylon has started to feel tired. Not tired in a bad way, more like an old thought that has been thought so many times it no longer resists. And this is usually where memory changes its purpose. At first, memory wants to teach. Then it wants to warn. Then it wants to inspire. Eventually, it just wants to exist. Babylon reaches that stage very early in its afterlife. People stop asking what it can do for them. They stop trying to extract lessons. It becomes background, a name you recognize instantly but rarely interrogate. And the Hanging Gardens settle into that same mental category. They're not evidence, they're not argument, they're atmosphere, which is the final form of most historical ideas. When something becomes atmospheric, it stops being debated, it just colors the room. And Babylon colors a lot of rooms. Libraries, museums, late-night documentaries, history channels playing quietly while someone falls asleep on the couch. It's always there, never demanding attention, never fully gone, and the gardens are always there too, hovering just above the ruins. Not planted, not harvested, just present. This is how myths survive longest, not by being defended, but by being unobtrusive. No one argues with the Hanging Gardens at 2 a.m. They don't challenge your worldview. They don't ask you to care deeply. They simply exist long enough for your thoughts to slow down. Which is why they fit so well in bedtime history. They're passive. They don't rush. They don't climax. They just remain. And in that remaining, they become soothing. Babylon itself becomes soothing in hindsight, which would surprise anyone who actually lived there. But hindsight has a way of sanding down sharp corners. Crowds disappear, smells vanish, noise dissolves. All that remains is scale and quiet. And humans love quiet when they're tired. The ancient world becomes quieter the further away it gets. Wars turn into dates, famines turn into footnotes, oppression turned into vocabulary, and gardens turn into symbols. The Hanging Gardens no longer belong to Babylon. They belong to us, to our need for something gentle inside overwhelming systems. And once they belong to us, they don't need Babylon to function anymore. They can float free. Which is why you'll find references to them completely detached from Mesopotamia, used in poetry, used in architecture metaphors, used in marketing copy for luxury apartments. Hanging Gardens becomes shorthand for elevated calm. And no one stops to ask whose calm it was, or who carried the water, or who pruned the trees. Those questions feel loud, and loud questions don't last long in memory. Quiet images do. So Babylon, stripped of its daily reality, becomes a quiet image, a silhouette against a pale sky. And the Hanging Gardens become a soft blur of green around that silhouette. And once that happens, history stops behaving like history again. It behaves like furniture, something you arrange around your life, something you don't interrogate every time you sit near it. And that's not a failure of memory. It's memory doing what it evolved to do, preserve comfort, not accuracy. Which is why the most accurate histories are rarely the most remembered. They're too busy, too complicated, too human. The Hanging Gardens survive because they simplify. They say, even here there was beauty. And humans crave that sentence, especially looking backward, especially when the present feels chaotic. Which brings us to a strange realization. The Hanging Gardens don't actually tell us much about Babylon. They tell us about the people who kept repeating the story. They tell us what later cultures wanted ancient power to look like. Controlled, gentle, a little sentimental, not terrifying, not overwhelming, just impressive enough to admire without fear. And Babylon obliges. It stays still. It lets us project. It doesn't correct us. And the gardens stay green forever. They never wilt. They never overgrow. They never need maintenance.
They're the perfect historical object because they don't age, and aging is what makes history uncomfortable. Real gardens decay, imagined ones don't. Real cities rot, symbolic ones hover. So Babylon becomes symbolic, and symbols are light enough to carry into sleep, which is where this kind of history belongs. Not as instruction, not as warning, but as background noise for the mind to drift against. A low hum of ancient ambition softened by leaves. In the next part, we'll barely move at all. We'll let Babylon fade even further until it's almost indistinguishable from other ancient cities that exist mostly as names. No revelations, no conclusions, just the slow flattening of time. Stay relaxed. There's nowhere else we need to be.
All right. Still drifting. No need to adjust your position. History has already slowed itself down for us. At a certain distance, ancient cities begin to blur together. Babylon, Nineveh, Ur, Thebes, Memphis. Their names remain distinct, but their emotional shapes start overlapping. They become variations on a theme. Walls, temples, rulers with titles that sound impressive but vague, populations that worked very hard and were rarely thanked, and somewhere, usually, a garden. Sometimes real, sometimes implied, sometimes entirely imagined after the fact. This isn't a failure of learning, it's the natural compression of memory. The human brain can only hold so much specificity before it starts rounding edges. So Babylon eventually joins a mental category called ancient greatness. And once it's there, it stops competing. It no longer needs to stand out. Its uniqueness becomes optional. Which is when myths like the Hanging Gardens become even more useful. They act as identifiers. Oh right, Babylon, that's the one with the gardens. Not the laws, not the trade networks, not the administrative genius. The gardens. Because plants are easier to remember than policy. And because softness differentiates better than strength. Every ancient city had power. Not every ancient city had imagined greenery spilling off its rooftops. So Babylon keeps that. And in keeping it, it becomes less threatening. The idea of Babylon stops being about domination and starts being about balance. Which is ironic, because balance was not exactly its strong suit. But memory doesn't reward accuracy. It rewards usability. Babylon becomes usable as a reference point, a place that was big, impressive, and importantly, human enough to want beauty. And that makes it safe to think about while half asleep. You don't have to brace yourself. You don't have to engage deeply. You can let the name wash over you. Babylon. It sounds heavy, but it behaves lightly now, which is what happens to most things that survive long enough. They shed their urgency. They lose their edges. They become ambient. The Hanging Gardens especially become ambient. They don't belong to a moment. They don't demand context. They float freely across centuries. A Greek writer imagines them. A Roman repeats them. A medieval scholar copies them. A Renaissance artist paints them. And a modern narrator whispers about them at 1 a.m. And each time they change slightly. They become less specific, less demanding, more soothing.
By the time they reach us, they're barely tethered to Babylon at all. They're just nice. And nice things survive. They don't provoke correction. They don't trigger argument unless someone is feeling particularly awake. And most people encountering Babylon these days are not awake. They're tired. They're listening passively. They're letting history play in the background while their mind powers down. And Babylon is perfect for that. It's ancient enough to feel distant, famous enough to feel familiar, unclear enough to avoid cognitive strain. And the hanging gardens are the softest possible detail you could attach to it. They require no dates, no diagrams, no effort, just an image. Green, layered, quiet. Water moving upward in defiance of gravity, but not in a way that feels stressful. Even the engineering, when mentioned, feels gentle. Clever, not overwhelming. Impressive, not alarming. So Babylon becomes a lullaby of ambition. A place where humans once tried very hard, succeeded briefly, and left behind a nice picture. And that picture doesn't care if it's accurate. It cares if it's calming, which it is. This is why the hanging gardens don't disappear even when scholars raise doubts. Doubt is sharp. The gardens are soft. Soft wins when the lights are low. And so Babylon stays as it is in our collective imagination. Not fully real, not fully fictional, just present. A silhouette of walls, a suggestion of leaves, and a sense that once, long ago, people wanted something pleasant inside something massive, which is a desire that never really goes away. In the next part, we'll let Babylon dissolve almost completely. We'll talk about what happens when even the symbols stop being distinct, and all that remains is the feeling history leaves behind. No analysis, no conclusions, just the residue. Stay comfortable.
All right, no movement required, no effort at all. At this point, Babylon is barely a place. It's more like a temperature, a low, steady warmth in the background of human thought. You don't focus on it. You don't examine it. You just notice when it's there. And this is what happens when history finally stops being information. It becomes sensation. Most people don't remember Babylon as dates or rulers or administrative systems. They remember it as ancient, as vast, as important somehow. Those words don't explain anything. They don't need to. They describe how Babylon feels, and the hanging gardens feel calm, which is interesting because calm is not what most empires feel like when they're alive. But once they're gone, calm is all they have left. The noise doesn't survive. The shouting, the orders, the daily grind of logistics, that all evaporates. What remains is emotional residue, and Babylon's residue is strangely gentle. Part of that comes from distance, part of it comes from repetition, but a large part of it comes from the fact that Babylon has been retold so many times by so many people that it has been sanded smooth. Every retelling removes a little friction, every translation simplifies, every summary softens, and every sleepy narration lowers the volume just a bit more, until Babylon becomes something you can drift past without resistance. And the hanging gardens become a symbol without weight. They don't press down, they lift slightly. They suggest upward movement without urgency, which is exactly what tired minds want. This is why ancient history works so well as background. It's far enough away that it can't demand action. It doesn't ask you to fix anything. It doesn't expect engagement. It simply exists, quietly reminding you that things rise, things fall, and eventually everything becomes story. Babylon is very good at that reminder. It rose dramatically. It fell thoroughly. And now it exists almost entirely as narrative texture. The hanging gardens are texture too. Soft texture. Green texture. The kind you barely register consciously. And when history becomes texture, it stops arguing with you. It doesn't insist on meaning. It allows interpretation without pressure. Which is why, at this stage, it doesn't really matter whether the gardens existed. Their function is complete. They have transitioned fully into feeling, and feelings don't require footnotes. They require space, which Babylon has in abundance, because no one lives there anymore. That absence creates room for imagination, room for projection, room for rest. Living cities don't give you that. They're busy, they're demanding. Ruined cities are polite. They don't interrupt. And Babylon is extremely polite now. It waits patiently in textbooks, in museum labels, in late-night videos. It doesn't push. It doesn't compete. It lets other histories take center stage when needed. And when it does appear, it arrives with a familiar softness. Oh, Babylon. The tone is already set. Ancient, faded, manageable. And the hanging gardens arrive with it, like a comfortable piece of furniture that always seems to be in the room no matter whose house you're in. Not intrusive, just there. This is how myths age gracefully. They don't escalate, they de-escalate. They become quieter with each generation, until they're almost indistinguishable from mood. And that mood is nostalgia for a past that never quite existed as we imagine it. But nostalgia doesn't care. It thrives on approximation. Babylon approximates greatness. The gardens approximate beauty. And together they approximate a version of the past that feels safe to visit mentally. Not demanding, not accusatory, just present. Which is why at this stage you can listen to this and feel your thoughts slowing down. The story isn't going anywhere. There's no twist, no revelation waiting, just the steady continuation of something very old and very quiet. And that's intentional, because the true legacy of places like Babylon isn't what they built. It's what they allow us to feel centuries later. A sense that even overwhelming systems eventually soften, that even rigid structures dissolve into stories, that even power leaves behind something gentle if given enough time. And the hanging gardens, real or imagined, are that gentleness made visible. They say, even here, eventually, things grew. And that's a reassuring thought when everything feels heavy. In the next part, we won't introduce anything new. We'll just let Babylon sit where it is in the mind, and we'll observe how, without effort, it slowly fades into the same quiet category as all the other ancient memes that hum softly in the background of human memory. No conclusions, just continuation. Stay relaxed. All right. Still steady, still slow. At this point, Babylon is mostly a sound, a collection of syllables that carries weight without needing explanation. Babylon. You don't picture streets anymore. You don't imagine crowds. You hear the word, and your mind supplies a vague sense of antiquity, scale, and distance. That's all. And that's enough. This is the final stage of historical memory, when names stop pointing to locations and start pointing to feelings. Babylon joins a long list of places that exist more comfortably as echoes than as realities. Atlantis, Troy, Eden. Different categories, different levels of evidence, but the same mental behavior. We stop asking where they were. We start asking what they represent. And eventually, we stop asking altogether. They simply exist as reference points floating quietly in the background. Babylon floats particularly well. It has no living population to contradict us, no modern identity to complicate things. It's safely sealed in the past. And sealed pasts are easy to handle. The hanging gardens float with it. They don't need coordinates. They don't need reconstruction diagrams. They exist as a soft vertical gesture. Upward, green, calm. They don't belong to any specific moment. They belong to the idea that humans, even while building systems that crush individuality, still wanted beauty nearby. Whether that was true in Babylon is almost beside the point now, because it has become true everywhere else. Modern cities build rooftop gardens for the same reason we imagine ancient ones, not because they change the system, but because they soften living inside it. So when we hear about the hanging gardens, we're really hearing about ourselves, our discomfort with scale, our need for relief, our desire to believe that someone, somewhere, once paused long enough to plant something unnecessary. And unnecessary things are deeply human. Babylon, stripped of its complexity, becomes a canvas for that belief. It becomes proof, not historical proof, but emotional proof, that power and beauty don't have to be mutually exclusive, even if that proof is symbolic. Symbols are efficient. They require less energy than facts, and when you're tired, efficiency matters. Which is why this story keeps being retold in exactly this tone. Slow, measured, uninsistent. The hanging gardens aren't shouted, they're murmured. They don't demand admiration, they invite rest. And Babylon, once the center of a world system, now exists mainly to support that invitation, which is a strange fate for an empire, but not an uncommon one. Most empires end up like this, reduced to lessons, then metaphors, then ambiance. Babylon just reached the ambiance stage earlier than most, and it stayed there. Which is why even after centuries of scholarship questioning the gardens, they remain. Because removing them would make Babylon feel colder, and humans instinctively resist making the past colder than it already is. We add warmth, we add green, we add water moving upward, improbably but calmly, and then we let the image rest. No urgency, no follow-up questions, just acceptance. This is also why Babylon works so well at night. Darkness reduces detail, shadows smooth shapes, and ancient cities look better in low light. Their broken edges disappear, their gaps feel intentional. Babylon in the dark becomes elegant, and the hanging gardens glow softly in imagination. Not bright, not vivid, just enough to suggest life continuing quietly somewhere above the stone. And that suggestion is comforting. It says that even when things end, they don't end harshly. They fade. They become stories. They become names. And eventually, they become echoes. Babylon is an echo now, a very old one, and the hanging gardens are the part of that echo that sounds like leaves, which is a pleasant sound to drift off to. In the next part, we'll let even the echoes soften further. We'll talk about what happens when history becomes so distant that it stops being about the past at all and starts being about how humans experience time. No facts, no debates, just the slow unfolding of perspective. Stay where you are. All right, still moving, but only barely. At this point, history has let go of its original job. It's no longer about recording what happened. It's about regulating how time feels. Babylon isn't ancient because of a date. It's ancient because it sits far enough away that it no longer competes with the present. That distance creates a strange effect. The further back something goes, the more evenly it spreads out in the mind. Sharp moments flatten, busy years dissolve, centuries compress into a single, manageable sensation. Babylon becomes less of a timeline and more of a horizon. You don't walk toward it, you look at it. And the hanging gardens sit right at that horizon line. Not foreground, not background, just there. They don't belong to a specific king anymore. They don't belong to a specific century. They belong to the idea that long ago once had texture. And that texture matters more than sequence when people are tired. Sequence requires effort. Texture does not. This is why bedtime history drifts away from chronology. Not because chronology is unimportant, but because the brain, when relaxing, prefers atmosphere over order. Babylon provides atmosphere effortlessly. Its name alone carries weight, age, and distance. You don't need to explain it. And when you add the hanging gardens, you add contrast, stone and green, law and growth, control and softness. Those contrasts are easy to absorb. They don't demand interpretation. They just coexist, which is very different from how history behaves when you're awake and alert. Then it argues, it corrects, it footnotes. But when history stops belonging to the past and starts belonging to the present moment of listening, it changes tone. It becomes permissive. It allows ambiguity. It allows contradiction. Babylon can be both terrifying and gentle. The gardens can be both real and imaginary. No one is checking, and that freedom is relaxing. Because the present is already full of things that insist on being precise. Deadlines, schedules, notifications. Ancient history, especially ancient history softened by myth, offers relief from that insistence. It doesn't need you to do anything. It doesn't need you to remember everything. It just asks you to let it pass through. Babylon passes through easily. It doesn't snag on modern concerns. Its problems are over. Its arguments are settled by time itself. And all that remains is the sensation of depth. Deep time. Time so deep it feels padded. The hanging gardens add padding. They act like a cushion between then and now. They absorb impact. They prevent the past from feeling too harsh when it brushes against the present. And humans have always done this. Whenever the past feels too brutal, too alien, too uncomfortable, we soften it. We add rituals. We add beauty. We add stories where someone pauses to admire a flower. Because that makes the past feel relatable. And relatability makes it safe. Babylon as an empire was not safe. Babylon as a memory is. And safety is what allows drifting, which is what's happening now. The story is no longer moving forward, it's spreading outward. Babylon connects to other ancient names. The hanging gardens connect to other imagined refuges. They blend into a larger mental landscape made of ruins, myths, and softened edges. A landscape that exists almost entirely for quiet contemplation, or quiet avoidance. Both are acceptable. And in that landscape, history stops belonging to the past. It belongs to the present moment of rest, to the listener lying still, to the low light in the room, to the steady pace of a voice that doesn't need to arrive anywhere. Babylon becomes something you visit without traveling. The hanging gardens become something you imagine without effort. And time itself becomes less linear. Moments stretch, thoughts wander, and history becomes a gentle current rather than a sequence of events. which is why at this stage, there's nothing new to introduce. No new facts would survive here anyway. They'd feel intrusive, too sharp. Instead, everything that remains simply continues to be. Babylon remains ancient, the gardens remain green, and you remain comfortably distant from both. In the next part, we'll let this distance widen just a little more. We'll observe how, eventually, even names like Babylon dissolve into something even simpler, a sense, a tone, a quiet acknowledgement that time is vast and humans have always tried to make it feel manageable. No effort required. Just let it happen. All right, still here, still slow. At this point, time itself has started to behave differently. Not faster, not slower, just softer. Babylon, which once demanded attention, now hums quietly behind everything else. It no longer interrupts thought. It doesn't compete with the present. It sits behind it, like distant traffic you only notice when it briefly goes silent. This is what happens when time gets long enough. Everything turns into background noise, even empires. Babylon once decided the rhythm of entire regions. Now it barely nudges the rhythm of a sentence. And the hanging gardens, those soft, improbable structures, fade into an even gentler frequency. They're not images anymore. They're not ideas. They're mood. A suggestion that the past wasn't entirely hostile. A reassurance that even under immense systems, someone imagined softness. And that suggestion doesn't need volume. It works best quietly. Because background noise doesn't ask for focus, it allows thought to drift in and out. Which is why stories like this survive so well in low-energy spaces. They don't insist on being understood. They're fine being half-heard. Babylon is perfectly suited to that role. It doesn't require correction in the moment. It doesn't demand engagement. You can let it exist at the edge of awareness, and it still does its job, which is to remind you, gently, that time keeps going no matter how serious things feel right now. Empires collapse, cities disappear, even the most carefully organized systems become footnotes, and yet, somehow, stories remain. Not sharp ones, not urgent ones, comfortable ones. The hanging gardens remain because they're comfortable. They don't accuse the past of cruelty. They don't force the present to reckon. They just say, there was beauty too. And humans accept that easily, especially when tired, especially when the present feels overbuilt. Babylon becomes a kind of reassurance through distance. If something that vast could vanish and still feel gentle in memory, then maybe not everything has to be held so tightly. Maybe intensity isn't permanent. Maybe pressure eases with time. That's not a historical lesson. It's an emotional one, and it doesn't need to be accurate to be effective. Accuracy would complicate it. It would add texture where smoothness is preferred. So we let the smooth version stay. We let Babylon be ancient without being specific. We let the hanging gardens be green without being proven. And time turns them into ambient reassurance. This is also why the story never really ends. There's no final image, no definitive conclusion. Because background noise doesn't conclude. It just continues until it fades into silence. And even silence isn't abrupt. It arrives gradually. Like this. Babylon becomes less a subject and more a feeling that you've been hearing for so long you forget when it started. The hanging gardens become indistinguishable from other imagined refuges. They merge with every peaceful image humans have ever used to soften the weight of complexity. A courtyard, a shaded path, water moving quietly nearby. They all serve the same purpose: to make overwhelming structures feel survivable. And Babylon, in its final form, is no longer overwhelming. It's manageable. It fits inside a sentence, inside a thought, inside a moment of drifting attention, which is the ultimate reduction of power. Not destruction, normalization. Time normalizes everything, even wonders, even empires, even myths. And once normalized, they become safe, which is why you can rest here. Nothing is going to demand anything from you. Babylon won't suddenly reassert itself. The gardens won't suddenly collapse. They've already completed their transformation, from place to story, to mood, to background noise. And background noise is where the mind can finally relax. In the next part, we'll let even that background noise thin out. We'll approach the points where history stops being distinguishable from silence. No drama, no ending. Just the slow settling of everything into quiet. Stay exactly as you are. All right, no effort, no attention required. At this point, even the background noise has started to thin. Babylon, which once filled pages and monuments and arguments, now barely registers as a distinct thought. It's more like a pause, a soft space between ideas. And this is where history finally dissolves into something almost indistinguishable from rest. When there's enough distance, the mind stops holding on to names. It lets go. Babylon becomes less Babylon and more long ago. The hanging gardens become less wonders of the world and more something pleasant that might have been. And those reductions aren't losses, they are relief. Because holding detail takes energy. Letting go does not. This is the stage where ancient history stops functioning as knowledge and starts functioning as reassurance. Reassurance that everything intense eventually becomes quiet, that complexity doesn't last forever in its sharp form, that even the most carefully controlled systems loosen their grip with time. Babylon controlled trade, Babylon controlled law, Babylon controlled meaning. Now it controls nothing. And that's comforting. It suggests that nothing currently overwhelming you will stay overwhelming indefinitely, not in the long view. And the hanging gardens, whether real terraces or imagined ones, offer a final, gentle suggestion that beauty doesn't need to be permanent to matter. It can be brief. It can be exaggerated. It can even be invented after the fact. If it softens memory, it has already done its job. Which is why the gardens don't disappear when questioned. They fade instead. They become less concrete, more impressionistic, less structure, more color, less history, more feeling. And eventually, they're not even visual. They're just the idea that somewhere inside something heavy, someone imagined lightness. And that idea doesn't need form. It floats. This is where the story reaches its most honest point. Not because everything has been explained, but because nothing needs to be. Babylon doesn't need defending. The gardens don't need proving. Time has taken responsibility for both. And time, unlike people, doesn't argue. It just wears things down, slowly, patiently, until what remains is smooth enough not to catch on the mind. And once things stop catching,
the mind drifts, which is what's happening now. History has stopped asking to be remembered. It's content being felt vaguely, a distant echo of stone and leaves, a sense that something vast once existed, mattered intensely for a while, and then became quiet enough to sit beside sleep. And that's a good place for it. Not every story needs an ending. Some stories need a gentle disappearance. Babylon disappears well. The Hanging Gardens disappear beautifully. They don't collapse. They don't burn. They simply lose definition. And in losing definition, they gain usefulness. They become part of the soft mental landscape people carry without effort, a background tone that says, this too will pass, even empires, even wonders. And now there's almost nothing left to say, not because the story is finished, but because it has thinned into something that doesn't require words, just presence, just the sense of time stretching far beyond urgency. If this were silence, it would be a friendly one, not empty, just unoccupied. And that's where we'll leave things drifting. No conclusion, no final thought, just the quiet understanding that long ago, somewhere, people built things, imagined things, and then let them go. And now, so can you. Stay right here.
All right, this is the last stretch. Not because anything ends here, but because there's nothing left that needs carrying forward. By now, Babylon isn't really present anymore. It hasn't vanished, it's just settled, like dust after movement stops. You don't notice it falling, you only notice the calm that comes after. The Hanging Gardens are there too, but only as a suggestion. Not vines, not terraces, just the idea that something unnecessary and gentle once existed inside something vast and demanding. And even that idea is beginning to loosen, which is fine. Stories don't need to stay sharp forever. They're allowed to dissolve. In fact, that's usually their most peaceful form. When history reaches this stage, it stops being about people, places, or events. It becomes about scale, the scale of time, the scale of forgetting, the scale of how small urgency becomes when stretched across centuries. Babylon once felt immediate to millions of people. Deadlines mattered, orders mattered, walls mattered. Now, none of that does. What remains is the sensation that humans have always tried very hard to organize their world and just as hard to soften it afterward. That's the only pattern that survives intact. Build something overwhelming, then imagine a garden inside it. Repeat. Babylon did it, or at least we decided it did, and that decision has been comforting enough to keep. So the story stays. Not as fact, not as proof, as background reassurance that even when systems grow too large, too rigid, too loud, people still look for shade, and if they can't find it, they invent it, which might be the most human habit of all. Now there's nothing left to analyze. Analysis would feel intrusive here, too bright, too awake. Instead, everything simply rests. Babylon rests, the gardens rest, even the idea of ancient wonders rest. They no longer need defending or explaining. They've already been absorbed into the quiet layer of memory that exists mostly to slow the mind down. And that's where they belong. Not in arguments, not in debates, but in the long, gentle exhale that follows thinking. If you try to picture Babylon now, it won't come easily, and that's okay. It means the story has done what it was supposed to do. It carried you far enough away from urgency that details no longer matter. Only tone, only calm, only the sense that time is wide and nothing needs resolving tonight. The hanging gardens don't need to hang anymore. They don't need height. They don't need stone beneath them. They're just the feeling of green in a place that no longer exists. And that feeling doesn't ask for attention. It simply accompanies silence. So we'll leave it there, not with an ending, but with a pause that doesn't need filling. Babylon has faded, the gardens have softened, and history, for now, has stopped speaking. You don't need to listen anymore. Just let the quiet do what it does best.